So a couple of things I wanted to show that I happen to have in my collection right now that are related to tonight's event. The first is a copy of a book that Susie Young Gates wrote along with Leah Widsoe, The Life Story of Brigham Young. This was published in 1930 in New York. This particular copy is the first for me, but it's actually inscribed by Susie Young. And November 8th, 1930, she's writing to an individual by the name of John Hoppler, who I don't know, but she says, "For whom I have high respect and loyal friendship." I can't read it, but whose word is his bond, and who has my father's own gift, to control men without tyranny, and yet with a firm hand. God bless him in his arduous and highly important position. The author, Susie Young Gates. So, not sure who that is. Do you know that name? But quite an interesting book, recently purchased by one of my customers. A couple of things that I'm in the process of obtaining, but are not mine quite yet. But this is probably the highlight of the collection. This is a copy of the biography and family record of Lorenzo Snow, put out by his sister Eliza R. Snow Smith. And this particular copy, look there, is inscribed to Sousa by Lorenzo Snow. Now when I first got this, you can see it's in ballpoint pen, and that kind of really threw me for a loop because there were no ballpoint pens at the time of Lorenzo Snow's life that I'm aware of. And I wasn't quite sure what that was, but as we looked more carefully, you can see that someone has traced over his original inscription that was in pencil, which was his primary source. So this was Sousa's copy, signed to her, by the prophet Lorenzo Snow. And it contains several of her stamps, Sousa Y. Gates. This was later, it has her bookplate in the front. Mrs. Susie Young Gates kindly returned this book to the owner. And then it's signed by G. Homer Durham, who was Gates's grandson. So, fun copy. Another book from her collection. This one she signed. Susie Young Gates bought March 28th, 1933, and this is The Heroines of Mormondom. And then lastly, this was a book I actually had never seen before. It's called The World's Fair Ecclesiastical History of Utah. Anybody ever seen that before? Craig, you know the book?
I've seen it, yeah.
Okay. Wasn't one I was familiar with, but it has several of her stamps in there, as well as her signature. So it's kind of some fun things that we get through the store from time to time, and if you're ever interested in that type of thing or others, we're happy to help you find them. Brian, is there any other book or event related things that I've forgotten here? Usually we have kind of a list of things to go over, but tonight
the next kind of big one would be maybe Method Infinite from Coker, but that's August.
Yeah, we're still months and months away. So, okay, well, I won't bore you any further. Then I'm just going to give basically what it says in the back of the book here about our author tonight. Graduated from Stanford University, obtained his MD from Yale School of Medicine with postgraduate work at the University of Utah Hospital and the Yale New Haven Hospital. He was a practicing surgeon in Portland, Oregon for 32 years before he retired and taught English at Ocean University in China through the BYU China Teachers Program. He's accompanied this evening with his wife, Mary Sue, who is a great-great-granddaughter of Susie Young Gates. And we're so grateful to have him here tonight. Without further ado, we'll turn the time over to him. Thank you for being here.
Can you hear me okay? Gary, Heidi, can you hear me okay? I'll do without the microphone. It's good to be here. It's good to welcome all of you here. This has been about an 11-year labor of love. My wife has cajoled, forced, twisted my hand to get this done. She is actually a great-granddaughter of Susie Young Gates. And when we first met in 1966, she said she had a famous great-grandmother. And little did I realize that it was Susie Young Gates. Now, if I start waning and you can't hear me, let me know. Just wave your hand, Mindy. Hi, Jim, Susan, nice to see you. Basically, this book has its genesis about 11 years ago. I had promised my wife that if nobody else wrote the biography of Susie Young Gates, that I would do it someday after I retired. Well, that was, we've been married for 52 years now, and so finally over the last 11 years, I have worked on this. We've spent 5 years overseas teaching English in mainland China and being a medical advisor in Brazil and Hong Kong, and about 6 years of working 40 to 70 hours a week writing this book. I can tell you that it is accurate. I am a scientist by training, and I am one of my pet peeves about some historians is their ability to conjecture. Well, this happened, and so this probably was the cause of it, and the cause of that was da-da-da-da. Hey, Jim and Susan, there are a couple of chairs right over here. So I think one of the challenges we have is we can describe what people do and how they do it, but to ascribe motivation to them, I think, is very, very dangerous. And so I am at odds with another historian doing some work on Sousa, particularly with her conclusions. I think there's a great deal of conjecture. What you have here is not conjecture at all. Now, Leonard Arrington called Susie Young Gates his favorite Mormon damozel. And in my mind, there are three overarching women in Mormon female history. First was Eliza R. Snow, born in 1801. 27 years later, Emmeline B. Wells was born. And 28 years after that, Susie Young Gates was born. But I think it's just amazing. Susa's imprint is left everywhere in the history of Latter-day Saints. We use lesson manuals, which she wrote the first set of lesson manuals. She started the Young Woman's Journal. She started the Relief Society Journal, which became the Relief Society magazine. She hobnobbed with the very best, Susan B. Anthony, and anybody who had anything to do with suffragism in the early, late 19th and early 20th century. Susan knew them on an intimate basis. She was the press secretary for the National Council of Women, the International Council of Women. She went to Europe 3 times, and she had a footprint everywhere. She had 13 children, 8 of whom died either in infancy. One of her sons died at 19. The others were all 7 years or younger. Just on Tuesday, my wife and I went down to Provo, to the Provo City Cemetery, and there is, right very close to the edge of the cemetery, is a small monument to Jacob Gates. Now, Jacob Gates was Jacob F. Gates's father. He was a general authority, 70, who lived in Provo, and was a general authority from Provo. As you're aware, many times in the 19th century, particularly, general authorities lived in northern Utah, southern Utah, everywhere. And next to him is his wife, who joined the church at age 16 in Britain, ran away from home, and met Jacob Gates, who was one of the wagon masters of an immigration company from England. And just behind them are Susa and Jacob Gates' headstone, surrounded on all sides by 7 children who died all before the age of 7 years. So one of the things that has bothered me over time is that there seems to be very little sympathy for 𝘠𝘴. And I think there are reasons for that. She had a very domineering personality. She said what she wanted to say. She was forceful. She had absolutely no problem with taking on people. The book outlines, head-on accounts that she had with B.H. Roberts, James E. Talmage, Clarissa Williams, Emmeline Wells, Amy Brown Lyman particularly. And so 𝘠𝘴 was not a shrinking violet, and I think people tended to oftentimes be polarized around her as they were around her father. But I love 𝘠𝘴, and I have a sort of a running battle with a couple of historians. One of them actually gave me a lot of her materials. She said, well, I just couldn't write a biography about 𝘠𝘴 because I didn't like her. And I said, well, why didn't you like her? Well, I didn't like her because she said bad things about Emma Smith, and because she wrote this series in the Relief Society magazine in the late teens about women with many children. So if you had over 16 children, you would probably become a woman of honor in the Relief Society editorial page with your biography written by 𝘠𝘴. And I thought, well, I personally, with the deaths of her children, all the sad experiences that she had in life, I personally find 𝘠𝘴 to be a very sympathetic personality. She just did it all, and I think in terms of her writings, let's just say a couple of words about that. She was a pretty poor poet. She wasn't much of a poet. Her books were, she wrote a lot of short stories. We'll never know how many short stories she wrote just because they appeared everywhere, many times under pseudonyms. Someone tried one time to make a list of all the short stories she'd written, and it was 22 pages, and there were ones that obviously were not there. Most of her short stories were somewhat treacly and kind of melodramatic and saccharine. My wife is up here giving me a dirty look, so I won't say any more about her short stories. They were pretty formulaic. I will tell you about the writing of the life story of Brigham Young. She had a manuscript which was hopelessly flawed, and they decided that it was going to take two volumes to publish this. And of course, this was the late 20s. Economic downturn had occurred, and they said, well, nobody is going to spend $5 for a 2-volume book by Susie Young Gates about her father, particularly written as loosely and poorly as it is. She sent it off to Fanny Bryce, who was a well-known author at the time, and Fanny Bryce sent it off to Simon & Schuster, and the president of the book company sent it back and said, this is awful. We can't possibly publish this. So fortunately about this time, her daughter, who was married to John A. Widtsoe, Leah Dunford Widtsoe, and her husband were sent to Liverpool to be in charge of the European mission. They were there from 1927 to 1933. And a fellow named Shepstone, who was an editor in England, had seen some copies of some of the chapters and said, well, this is promising. And so what happened is they decided they could not possibly have a 2-volume work. It just wouldn't sell, wouldn't be commercially successful. And so John A. Widtsoe and Leah Widtsoe, his wife, 𝘠𝘴's daughter and son-in-law, decided that they would work it through. And so they are the ones who turned it into a 1-volume work. And in fact, if you look at the book that was just shown to us, it has Leah R. Widtsoe as a co-author. It says Susie Young Gates in collaboration with Leah D. Widtsoe. Now, of course, Leah was a daughter of 𝘠𝘴 from her first husband. I'll just mention that briefly. I just finished reviewing an article on 𝘠𝘴's divorce from her first husband. She was married at age 16. to a dentist who was abusive, and she waited until he got sent on a mission to England to decide to divorce him. And his family, of course, faults Sousa for two things. Number one, getting divorced while their son/brother was on a mission, and number two, never ever mentioning his name again. It was just like it was just cut out. And in fact, it's kind of interesting, but I'm sure Sousa is rolling over in her grave, because if you go to volume 2 of Saints, the name of Alma B. Dunford is listed 6 times in the index, and Sousa never mentioned him once in the last 50 years of her life. And so in fact, I told the editor, I said, you know, Sousa's probably rolling over in her grave with Alma mentioned 5 times in Saints. But Sousa had this very unhappy marriage at age 16. She had 2 children. The first was Leah, and Leah, of course, married James E. Talmage, and they became a cause célèbre in the church. They were the couple of the early 20th century. He was president of Utah State, president of the University of Utah, an apostle, president of the European Mission, and they had a dog and pony show relating to nutrition and so forth that they took all over the world. There is a story told that Elder Wissow would always tell people that, you know, what they were eating was probably bad for them, and the story is told. I don't think it's apocryphal, that he was at a party with President David O. McKay, who was enjoying some strawberry shortcake, and he was saying, "Oh, this is really wonderful." And John A. Wissow started to open his mouth, and he just said, "John, leave my strawberry shortcake out of the word of wisdom." and so I think that, but in any event, Sousa had 5 children who survived to maturity. The first was Leah. Both of her daughters were married to members of the Quorum of the 12. Leah married John A. Wissow. Then the second child who survived was Emma Lucy Gates Bowen. And Emma Lucy was a very accomplished musician. She was one of the prima donnas of European opera in the first 15 years of the 20th century. She was an opera star in Germany and came home at the beginning of World War II. It's kind of an interesting story about how she escaped from the beginnings of World War I in Germany, went to England, and then finally was able to come home. Then the third child was B. Cecil. B. Cecil was an assistant director of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. He was a very prominent church musician. He wrote several cantatas, and Sousa did a lot of wrote a lot of the lyrics for B. Cecil's musical compositions. And then the fourth was a son named Harvey, who went by Hal. Hal wrote about 240 scripts in Hollywood. He was not active in the church, which was a source of great concern to Sousa. He was, as I say, one of the premier screenwriters in Hollywood during the 1930s and 1940s, died at an early age of 59 in 1948 in Hollywood. And then, of course, the fifth was Franklin Young Gates, who is my wife's grandfather. He was a head of sound research when talkies were first coming out in Hollywood in the late 1920s, and later started a sound company here in Salt Lake when all the movie studios started to cut their production during the Great Depression. But Sousa had an outstanding family. Getting back to her writings, Sousa's forte was editorials. Now, she didn't do real well with her. She wrote a couple of novels, The Prince of and John Stevens' Courtship, which were kind of thin plots, not great character development. John Stevens' Courtship was really the first full-length novel written by an LDS female author, and so of course the Mormon audience just absolutely fell in love with it. They just thought there was nothing like Susie Young Gates and her her somewhat sentimental fiction. But if you read her, you can go back to from 1889 to 1900 and go to the Young Woman's Journal. You can go from 1914 to 1922 and go through the Relief Society magazine. You'll find that she had really fine editorial skills, and that was her real forte. Anything else I should talk about, Mercy? Oh, the book. The book is how this came about. It was thought that 𝘠𝘶 had destroyed all of the records related to her life because of this unfortunate first marriage. And so for years and years, nobody wrote anything about 𝘠𝘶 other than a couple of vignettes. There were 2 vignettes written in the 1970s in collections about famous women authors. One was by Carolyn D. Person, who was a Durham. She was a daughter of Eudora Woodsoe Durham, John and Leah's daughter. And the other was written by Becky. At the time, her name was Cornwall, but now Bartholomew, and she wrote a vignette. Other than that, not much had been written, and it was thought that nobody knew exactly where 𝘠𝘶's collection of works was. It was thought that one of 2 things had happened. Either she had destroyed it all, or that her son Hal, who had always threatened to write a biography of his mother, had taken all the records to Los Angeles, where he lived, and they had been lost. Well, lo and behold, when Franklin Young Gates, 𝘠𝘶's last surviving child, a youngest who grew to maturity and last surviving child, died, his 2 daughters, Lorraine Gates Wilkinson, my mother-in-law, and her sister, Flory Gates Bennett, who was a soloist with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, went out to the garage, and lo and behold, they came across 113 boxes of 𝘠𝘶's materials. So suddenly we went from a situation where there was virtually nothing available to write about 𝘠𝘶's life to so much that nobody could take it on. So that's the story of how the book came about. Flory and Lorene, the daughters of the granddaughters of 𝘠𝘶, about 2 or 3 years later, took all these 103 boxes down to the church history library, and where they were cataloged and later digitized. And so, if you have any interest, it's collection 7962 at the church history library. You can go online and get virtually anything you want. But she's a fascinating lady. I think when you read the book, you'll come to have a real appreciation for her, a real love for her. She had a heart of gold. Yes, she was imperious. Yes, she was dominating. Yes, she was impatient. Yes, she suffered fools poorly. But she was withal a whirlwind. I am frankly amazed at all that she was able to accomplish in 77 years, and I consider it and I hope that I've done an honest job by her. I hope that when I meet her, which I'm sure I will someday, that she'll say, hey, I really enjoyed what you wrote about me. I'm sure there'll be a few things that she'll say, well, you should have followed your grandmother Romney's advice, which was you could have talked all day and not said that. But I have tried very hard to be inclusive. We've included her arguments with general authorities and other auxiliary presidents of the church. We've talked about her first divorce. We've talked about the possible dance about her husband Jacob F. maybe considering polygamy. We've talked about her love letter to Joseph F. Smith, which has just brought forth all kinds of questions. I think there was nothing other than just hero worship between 𝘠𝘶 and Joseph F. that caused her to write this really kind of sappy letter of admiration to President Joseph F. Smith. I will read. Do you have enough time? I'll read just a couple of things, and then we'll open it up for questions. This relates to the 𝘠𝘶 went to Hawaii and was there from 1885 to 1889 with her husband, who was in charge of the sugar plantation at 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢. And 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢 was not the paradisiacal spot that it is now. It was, hot, muggy, malaria-ridden, a terrible place to live. No air conditioning, no big swimming pool, and so forth. But shortly after they got there, they had another son. 3 sons were born to them. They went to Hawaii with 3 children. She bore 3 children during the 4 years they were there, and they lost these 2 little boys of diphtheria who died a week apart. And I'll just read a little bit here. Jay's condition quickly worsened, and Jay asked Susan to bless him with consecrated oil, which she did. Now remember, this is 19th century when women blessed people just like priesthood holders do today. Jacob Sr. rushed home from a conference in Honolulu, and he also gave blessings to the boy, as did other local members. Susan was 3 months pregnant, and Jacob finally persuaded her to get some rest at a neighbor's home. Jay was cared for that night by his father, and the next day, February 23rd, 1887, he slipped away. Oh, how brave, how patient, how manly our darling was, Susan wrote to her mother. He never complained. He was one of the noblest, choicest spirits ever sent to this sad earth. Mother, mother, I can't write anymore. It just pretty much near kills me. And then what happened? Joseph F. Smith had a dream, and he had dreamed that there were 2 spots for this burial site. And 3 days after Jay died, Jay was buried in a grave that Susan later noted was too wide for him. And 3 days after Jay died, his 3.5-year-old brother Carl became ill. Despite the priesthood blessings, the prayers, and the great faith summoned by the missionary families in 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢, Carl died on March 2nd, a week after his brother Jay's too wide grave would now accommodate Carl as well. A neighbor observed that Joseph F. Smith, who was there at the time, had a dream before the first died, and saw the grave made for 2. So here she is, a 30-year-old mother burying 2 little boys in Hawaii on a mission. As the months passed, neither Susan nor Jacob stopped thinking about their sons. Jacob wondered if the time will ever come when I can think of this bereavement with a degree of resignation. Susan wished she had written down some memories, a record of the little sayings and doings of my 2 angel boys, oh my noble Jay and my sweet Carly. How my heart longs for sight of your sweet faces. Every day 100 incidents brings back the lost joys, the present pains. She visited their graves often, and shortly after one visit wrote, oh, my darlings, how my heart aches in thinking of you, how I love you, and how I have missed you. Only one knows. This was 2 sons. Susan went through this same experience 6 more times in her life. She was a magnificent woman. I won't say any more. I've talked for about 20 minutes here, and I would be glad to answer any questions that any of you might have.
What was the most challenging part to write about, either because of a lack of historical material or conflicts that you had about someone you admired in a difficult situation that you had to weigh the evidence and make a judgment?
I think her divorce probably was the hardest. Not meaning to diss anybody, the Denver family feels they have their point of view, and the Gates family, of course, feels that they have their point of view. I tried very, very hard to be objective. Her first husband was a scoundrel during the divorce. He was one of, to give him credit, he was one of Utah's most famous early dentists, and he was very, very highly respected as a dentist. So I think that was the hardest. Another thing that was hard was to say, what do I do with this letter, these 2 letters written by Susan to Joseph F. Smith in 1906, saying, "Oh, thou great and wonderful warrior, how I have loved you over the years since I was 14 years old," and so forth. And of course, this was found in a collection up at the University of Utah, and the lady who found it said, "Oh my gosh, Susan Young Gates at age 14 was having an affair with Joseph F. Smith." Well, I don't believe that for a minute. I think she was just very dramatic and said, "Oh, I'm writing to you because you're such a magnificent, wonderful hunk of man, and I've always loved you. And
They were very close.
pardon?
They were close.
And they were very close. They were like brother and sister. In fact, when Joseph F. Smith died, they asked Susan to come over and sort of man the front part of the Beehive House while they were making arrangements for the funeral and so forth. What happened is Joseph F. Smith and his wife, Jelena Lamson, were on the underground. Those of you know, when U.S. Marshals were tracking people down for polygamy, many men just simply left the country. And Joseph F. Smith left Salt Lake for a period of 7 years while he was a counselor in the first presidency to several presidents. And I think that was difficult to sort of say, well, I am not a drama king. So when I hear these things, I sort of think, ho hum, But there are some historians who have tried to make this a very, very big deal. That Susan and Joseph F. were probably having an affair when he was 33 and she was 14. So those are some of the difficulties. Yeah. Any other questions, Devery?
Did Leah Dunford talk about her dad? Like, what were her views of her father?
What happened, of course, in the divorce, basically Alma Dunford came in and cleaned Sue's clock. He took everything. He even took her father's scriptures. He took Sue's copy of her Brigham Young's scriptures, and she had some flowers in frames with glass, and he said, I'm going to take those. And she said, well, pressed flowers are mine. You can take you can take the frames if you want to. And so she smashed the glass and all the frames, took out the glass, took out the pressed flowers, and said, here are your frames. And so the story is detailed in the book, but Leah always felt that she had to be true to her father, and
He got custody.
Pardon?
He got custody.
He got. What happened when they were divorced is he got Leah and she got Bailey. Susan got Bailey, the son, and the agreement was that at age 12 he would be able to decide who he wanted to live with. And when he was 10, Susan was going off to Hawaii. They wrote and asked Dr. Dunford for permission to take Susan and Alma Dunford's son to Hawaii. And he showed up at the train station. Dunford showed up at the train station with a police officer and said, you can't take him out of the country. And here, just 4 months after Susan had lost a baby, they are leaving for Hawaii, and there's this very dramatic scene down at the train station here in Salt Lake, and Bailey is ripped away from his father and didn't see her, but
From his mother.
from his mother's, and given to his father. And Bailey had a very, very tragic life. I mean, I've often wondered if Bailey had grown up with Jacob F. Gates as his stepfather, growing up with these fine brothers, B. Cecil, Franklin, and Hal, what would his life have been like? He actually died in an explosion in Butte, Montana at age 19 in the late 1890s. But getting back to your question, Leah always said, well, I have to be loyal to my father. And so she really had almost no contact with her mother until Susan came home in 1889 from Hawaii, and then they became very, very close. So they were like that for the rest of their lives. And I think Leah never did say much about her father other than that she loved him, and she felt that she had to have a sense of loyalty to him. He apparently repented of his drinking and gambling late in his life and died in 1919.
You write that in 1923 she was selected to be the head of the research bureau for the Genealogical Society.
Right.
And then just a few months later it was decided that should be a priesthood position, and
right.
It was yanked out, and Andrew Smith, I think, the son of Joseph F. Smith, was appointed in her place.
Mhm.
Do you have any color on what was going on there?
No, she was very happy to. Well, first of all, you need to understand that in 1922 she had resigned from the Relief Society General Board. She had been editor of the Relief Society magazine, and she was appointed to that by Joseph F. Smith. And she thought this was a lifetime appointment. And 𝘚𝘶 Williams, who was actually a daughter of George A. Smith, an apostle, became president when Emmeline B. Wells died. Was replaced at age 93. Emmeline B. Wells was General Relief Society president until 1921 at age 93, and she died like weeks later. They said from a broken heart, but I think it was frankly from old age. And then 𝘚𝘶 Williams became president of the Relief Society, and she and Amy Brown Lyman were like this, and they decided that this was going to be an annual reappointment. This was thrown on Sousa in 1922. So she left. She said, I'm going to resign. You obviously are not appreciative of my efforts. And so she resigned as a Relief Society editor and resigned from the General Board of the Relief Society. Shortly thereafter, as you mentioned, was named head of research. And I don't know the exact machinations that went on, but that only lasted for a few months, and the decision was made that this needed to be a priesthood assignment. And so they did make changes. And she doesn't really say much about that. And so I don't know what the deal was, other than the fact they decided that it needed to be a priesthood assignment. I think she accepted it quite well and continued. As you know, her overarching interest from about 1921 on, well, even before that, on the General Relief Society Board, she fought for genealogy to be taught in the Relief Society lessons, which put her at odds with the Relief Society General Board oftentimes, because they wanted this to be, sort of, lovely experience of holding hands and singing Kumbaya and doing a little bit of genealogy, rather than the hardcore stuff that Sousa wanted done. So really from about 1916 or 17 on, Sousa's main deal was genealogy. The last 17 years of her life, genealogy was the main focus of her life. And so it hurt her when she was relieved as head of research for the genealogy department, but she did fine and continued on with it for the rest of her life, which was about 10 years. She died in 1933.
Thank you.
Gary?
Can you tell us a little bit about Sousa, Leah, and B.H. Roberts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. John A. Widtsoe was sort of, we could talk about him as decade man. Sousa went back in 1892 to Harvard's summer school to improve her writing skills. She loved it, had a good time, and met Maud May Babcock, who was head of English and drama at the University of Utah for forever. And she brought Maud May Babcock back to Utah, and she joined Miss Babcock joined the church. She had such a wonderful time that she sent Leah back the next year, her daughter Leah back the next year to go to summer school with 3 other young women from Utah. And she had said how much she wanted John A. Widtsoe to meet her daughter, and right at that first point in 1922, Sousa had dreams of Leah marrying John Widtsoe. And it didn't turn out that way. John was heavily in debt. He was supporting his younger brother Osborne. He was supporting his mother Anna Garden Widtsoe, and trying to get through Harvard in a hurry. And so he kind of dilly-dallied. They met in 1893, and that is John and Leah, but did not marry until 1898. And at one point, Leah wrote John Widtsoe a little note saying, "Would you please return the pictures of my daughter that I gave you?" He was just not moving ahead rapidly enough to suit Sousa. Now, in the meantime, B.H. Roberts was getting himself into some trouble, getting elected to Congress, and Congress, of course, refusing to seat him because he was a polygamist. And in 1896, Leah was at the Pratt Institute in New York with Donette Smith, who was a daughter of Joseph F. Smith. And B.H. Roberts came back, and B.H. Roberts kind of took a shine to Leah. In fact, just before this meeting, I was talking. Who was I talking with about it? Somebody here, unless they left. And I just, in my 21st century mind, I just cannot imagine a 22-year-old, young 22-year-old Latter-day Saint girl running around all over New York with a married man. It just blows my mind. But B.H. Roberts was very interested in Leah, and made overtures of indicating that he might be interested in marrying her. Now, mind you, this was 6 years after the manifesto, and Sousa thought polygamy was just wonderful for everybody except Sousa, and she thought it was just marvelous. She wrote all kinds of articles, talking about the wonders and the magnificence and the marvels of polygamy, but she obviously opted to never enter into a polygamous relationship. Anyway, so B.H. Roberts and Leah had this little dalliance, innocent dalliance in New York, and Sousa kind of stuck herself in the middle of this. She was really peeved at 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢 by this time. He was not making any moves, not moving ahead, and she didn't like the way that 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢 was treating her daughter. And so she said, just look at this. He's a general authority. He's a marvelous man. Just think about the wonderful genes and what this would do for you. And she at one point, Sousa at one point actually talked about 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢 and said, well, he's a man from a different race. Well, he was Norwegian. And she said, well, he's a man from a different race, so I don't know how well this is going to work out for you, Leah. And then, of course, Leah came back in 1896. 1897, and took over her mother's place in domestic science at BYU. Sousa had started a domestic science program in 1896 at BYU, holding it as a placeholder for her daughter Leah, who was coming back in 1897. And then in 1897, Leah came back from New York City, having had this dalliance, if you will, with B.H. Roberts. And then he, at that point, 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢, who was up at in Logan, proposed to Leah, and they were married on June 1st, 1898. Does that answer your question? Anyways, it's really kind of interesting, and you can read, there's a marvelous book. 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢 was here earlier tonight. I just finished reading 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢's book on B.H. Roberts, which is marvelous, but he goes into, he gives about 6 pages to this romance between Leah and B.H. Roberts. And of course, at this particular time, as I say, Sousa was really irritated, frankly, at 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢. So it's really kind of interesting. I told Mary Sue, of the 5 people that Sousa's children married, there are private complaints about Sousa about 4 of them. He said unkind things about B. Cecil's wife. He said really unkind things about Franklin's wife, my wife's grandmother. She was one of the most angelic people I ever met, but Sousa just thought she was a spoiled little girl, and she wrote all these things about 𝘠𝘰𝘴𝘢. So well, he just can't make up his mind, and he's a man of a different race, and I don't know whether this would work out for my daughter to marry him or not. So the only one that she didn't really complain about was Albert E. Bowen, and I think that was because Emma Lucy didn't get married until she was 36, and I think that Sousa was just ready to heave a big sigh of relief that finally at age 36 her daughter Emma Lucy was getting married after this operatic career in Germany, and I think he was just happy to have Emma Lucy get married. Good question. Mike?
You mentioned something about a conflict between Emma Smith.
Oh, well, it's really kind of interesting. Until if those of you who are old timers, it was really about 1984 when it was that Avery and Tippett wrote their book on Mormon enigma, Emma Smith. And at that point, Emma Smith became respectable in the church. But I remember being a little boy, and nobody said anything nice about Emma Smith when I was a little boy growing up. And I think those of you who are old timers can remember that. Emma Smith was anathema. You know, she bailed out when it was easy to bail out and didn't stand by her husband, and so forth. So nobody liked Emma Smith until about 1994. And then this book came out called, it was a Mormon Enigma, Emma Smith, by Valerie Tippett and, is it Linda Avery?
Linda Newell.
Pardon?
Linda Newell.
Linda Newell, yeah, Linda Newell. And that completely changed the framework for how we now view Emma Smith. And Emma Smith suddenly became a great heroine. But Sousa didn't say anything about Emma that everybody else in the entire world at that time didn't say about her. And you know, she just said that Emma didn't stand by her man when he needed it the most.
It would be interesting, you know, I would guess, and it's conjecture, that some of her opinions might be formed from her father.
Oh, exactly, exactly. Brigham Young and Emma Smith were like that. You know, it wasn't helped that you know, right after Joseph died, Brigham went over to Emma's house and said, I want his Norwegian uniform. You know, and so, you know, they were loggerheads from the beginning. But in the book, it does talk some about Brigham Young's attempts to get Emma to come out to Utah.
Yeah, I think you were talking or maybe writing in here about the tension there was on the Brigham Young biography where,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the British, they wanted to have more polygamy in
Right.
there, and Leo was maybe editing some of it out.
Right.
I'm wondering, is the thought that it was Shepstone that was putting that polygamy in, or do you suppose that was part of Gates' original 2-volume manuscript that Leo was just further cutting down?
Sousa did not. I mean, I think everybody who wrote had anything to do with writing the book really wanted polygamy downplayed. The Brits were having a lot of difficulty at the time with Mormon polygamy. There was a lot of persecution of the Mormons in Britain at that time, and they just really kind of thought that they didn't want 𝘠𝘠𝘴 and 𝘠𝘠𝘴 really did not want polygamy in it at all. And they did. If you look at the pictures, if you compare the pictures in the English and the English and American versions, they have different pictures, and it's.
Yeah, just following up on that, the 4 or 5 parts that were printed in the periodical there in Britain before the book, do those vary quite a bit from what ended up in the book?
No, not what ended up in the British book. What happened is this guy named Shepstone, who was the British guy. He had met George Albert Smith and had gotten introduced to Sousa's manuscript and thought, well, this has some possibilities. Sousa had floated it around in America and not gotten very far, and so what they did was they took it to Britain, and they were going to have this big 16-part serial in British newspapers, and they only got through about 5, but because of the cost and the fact that the 2-volume manuscript was just unmanageable, I think we can thank John A. Widtsoe and Leah Widtsoe, who are both very good writers, scientifically trained, I might add, did a very good job of making it a 1-volume manageable book. But it is fun to look at the 2 volumes together and compare them. But there's no picture in Britain of Brigham's wives. In the American version, you'll see that there's a nice composite picture of all of his wives and so forth, but that did not appear in Britain.
Was the biography of Brigham Young motivated by her response to M.R. Werner's?
Yes, exactly.
Biography?
That's a good point. M.R. Werner had written a biography in about 1925, and she, in fact, she got a complimentary copy and sent it off to the library at BYU Library and said, I don't even want this in my house. You take it. and so she said, someone's got to write a good biography of my father. And so about a year later, she started the biography of her father, which was, I mean, much as I love Sousa, it was just totally unmanageable. You know, it was just unmanageable. And every American editor who looked at it said, "Whoa, keep me far away from this one." Robert?
You've had help from your mate. How much did Mary Sue help you in composing and going through the philosophies that were going to be exposed in this book?
A lot. Mary Sue, when we were dating, I was at medical school at Yale, and she was living with her father, who was president of Eastern States Mission in New York City, going to graduate school at Columbia. And she had a part-time job as an editorial assistant at Doubleday. So I can say that every word in here has been read about 5 times by my wife. And every time I said something that she didn't agree with, we would have a very spirited discussion about. And so she had a lot to do with it. And but she can tell you that I always loved Sousa. And this is a sympathetic version. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think one of the criticisms that may be offered by reviewers as well. Romney Burke was really soft on Sousa. I don't think I have been, just because, as I say, I got into all these thorny issues that her divorce, her quibbles with church leaders, her argument with Amy Brown Lyman, her argument with Clarissa Williams, her departure from the Belief Society General Board, and so forth. So I think it's pretty objective. But I don't conjecture on her motivations. I don't know Sousa's motivations. And I think, I told Mary Sue, you know, I lived with Susa Young Gates for 21 years. My mother was Susa Young Gates, writ small. I mean, you know, I'm sure that my mother and Susa Young Gates are great buddies because they're just so much alike. So one of the quibbles I have with some of the other people who have written about Susa is I really just don't think they understand her at all. What her motivations were, her life was not a life spent bemoaning the fact that she was a woman instead of a man, and she battled gender issues for a lifetime, which is what you'll read in some of the other stuff. That's just not true. But anyway, any other questions?
Did you come across any in your research on the book about Jacob's translation of the Book of Mormon into Hawaiian, that second edition?
Right. Jacob went to on his first mission in January 1877. And this is Jacob. Once again, just to kind of reiterate, Jacob's father was just Jacob Gates, born 1811 in Vermont, and he was the one who was a general in 4070. His son was Jacob Forsberry Gates, and Jacob F. Gates went in January 1877 to Hawaii on a mission. He was there until October of 1879, 2 years, and then went back in 1885 as in charge of the sugar plantation, stayed there until 1889. He became very fluent in Hawaiian, and in 1902, Joseph F. Smith asked him to do a second translation. There had been a translation done by George Q. Cannon and 𝘠𝘶𝘴𝘢 in 1852 in the Hawaiian language when the very first missionaries went there. So in 1902, about 50 years later, they wanted to do a second translation, and Jacob F. Gates was asked to do that. And Sousa does comment in some of her notes about Dad is working on the second translation of the Book of Mormon in Hawaiian, and he did finish that. And when we were, for the very first time we went to Hawaii, we saw some really, really old hymnals, and I looked in, and there was Jacob F. Gates' name, in the hymnal as having translated all those early Mormon hymns into Hawaiian. Well, it's been delightful to be here. It's nice to see 3 of my children here, several grandchildren, and I hope you enjoy the book. Hi, Elizabeth, and a niece. But I hope you enjoy the reading, and I can tell you it's accurate. It is accurate, and you're going to have to fill in a lot of the pieces for yourself, because I'm not going to try to tell you what Susa Young Gates' motivation was every day of her life.
Great.